Excellent. Well, welcome and thank you for being here for the final panel of what has been a really great conference. So thank you all for wonderful papers. Our next paper is Regina Lee, I'm sorry, how do you say it? Blaszczyk. Regina is an award-winning historian and author. She specializes in design, fashion, globalization, business, and technology. That sounds amazing, all of it. And she's widely, she's currently a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an associate editor of the Journal of Design History. She's also a founder and principal of Innovative Histories, a consulting firm. And she's also widely published in books including Imagining Consumers, American Consumer Society, and Producing Fashion, and many others. And the current work is going to be from a book which is coming out from MIT Press in September, The Color Revolution. And her talk will be Sunshine Yellow in the Cold War Kitchen, Color Revolution or Replacement Revolution, and we await.
Thank you all for having me here. I'm going to start this talk on the Sunshine Yellow in the Cold War Kitchen with an iconic image, an image you've probably all seen, and that is this picture of President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev taken in July 24th, 1959 at the American National Exhibition just outside of Moscow. This is a famous photograph that was widely published, taken by an AP photographer. It's really become a symbol sort of a Cold War, the Cold War race between the United States and the USSR. What's important about this image for my talk is that Nixon and Khrushchev are stopped at the kitchen, and over on the right-hand side is the open GE combination washer and dryer. This picture's in black and white, so it's not often known that this combination washer dryer is in sunshine yellow, pale yellow. It is documented, so we know this. These iconic images that we have from the visit to Moscow by Nixon really set the stage for much of our discussion of post-war consumer culture. And so we'll start there. I want to flash forward, however, to another image, and that's this image here. This guy is an American social critic named Vance Packard. He's the gentleman who's seated. Vance Packard was born in 1914, died in 1996. He was a journalist who, beginning in the 1950s, wrote a series of very important books that addressed sociological topics. He was most known for The Hidden Persuaders, where he lashed out against Madison Avenue in 1957, The Status Seekers, where he critiqued the American way of life in 1959, The Naked Society, where he looked at surveillance technologies in 1964, but most importantly for our discussion, for The Wastemakers, published in 1960. In The Wastemakers, Packard, who is as iconic as a social critic as is the kitchen debate for Cold War culture. In The Wastemakers, Packard makes many observations about American consumer culture and the role of business in using strategies of enticement and manipulation to convince American consumers to buy goods that they don't really want. For example, he says, nearly 3/5 of the things owned by the average American are things that are not central to his well-being. And one thing he latches out against is the concept of color matching. He sees color matching as evidence of a sinister, quote-unquote, replacement revolution. He points to artifacts like colored kitchen appliances, which appear on the scene in the post-war years, starting almost right after the war, and I can get into that in a minute. He points to appliances by the Frigidaire division of General Motors and other manufacturers such as General Electric as a part of a trilogy of these of evidence suggesting that the replacement revolution exists. He points to also colored telephones produced by Bell Labs. He looks at the big three automakers and the two-tone automobiles of the 1950s. And finally, again, he looks at the appliances, including the Frigidaire division of General Motors. Here we have the actual advertisement for a GE combination washer and dryer from mid-1950s. Now, my question is, who's right and who's wrong? Was Nixon right to point to the combination washer and dryer in Sunshine Yellow and say that this was an example of the improved standard of living? Or was Packard right to say that this is some sort of manipulation of consumers and creating desires that don't really exist, and so on and so forth? Well, those of you who've read my work probably understand where I come on this, but for those of you who don't know my work, I've got to step a bit backwards and tell you more. This paper is based on a book called The Color Revolution, which is coming out with the MIT Press in the fall. The Color Revolution is a study of the way in which businesses in the creative industries respond to opportunities created by the chemical industry, and how they learn to manage color for design practice. So let me step back and explain why I think that this question is important. In 1930, in February 1930, Fortune magazine, in its first issue, published an article called Color in Industry. And in this article, Fortune editors elaborated deeply and at great length on the proliferation of colored consumer products that poured into the marketplace in the 1920s. Everything from pots and pans to ladies' shoes that matched ladies' stockings, to stoves in two-tone colors, to new plastic earrings, and so on and so forth, flooded the American marketplace in the prosperous 1920s. Now, we know that not all consumers in the 1920s were able to participate in consumer society, but we know that ever more people were beginning to have access to a higher standard of living. So my question is, why, what, and in this article, in this Fortune article called Color in Industry, Fortune editors coined the term the color revolution to describe this burst of color that we see in the 1920s. So it was about 25 years ago, actually, when I first stumbled across this article, when I was a young whippersnapper digging through the archives at the Library of Congress on a Saturday afternoon, because that's what I like to do as a geek. And this was my idea of fun. And I kept this article in my back pocket and said, well, one day I'm going to revisit this. And so, you know, about 20 years later, I started to research it. So my book called The Color Revolution uses the Fortune article, Color in Industry, as a springboard for exploring some of the issues that come up in this article. It's not just an article about a book about the 1920s. It's actually a book that starts way back. It starts in the 1840s and 1850s with this moment. Does anyone recognize this moment or have any idea what this moment might be? I see someone. It's the invention of mauve. Oh my God. This is a great audience for me. Okay, chemistry, history nerds, exactly. This is a 1983 depiction of an 1856 event. This is a painting, an oil painting that's in the collections of the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia. It was done in 1983, and the guy in the middle is William Henry Perkin. He was at that point in 1856 a young teenage chemist who was at what became the Imperial College, the Royal College of Chemistry, and he's flanked on one side by the practical man, the workman in blue, and the capitalist in the suit on the other side. And he's working in his East End London lab, and he's doing a chemistry experiment, and he accidentally discovers the ability to create mauve using synthetic organic chemicals. This is a moment, for those of you who are chemists who know this, but those of you who aren't, this is often celebrated as the critical moment in the birth of the synthetic organic chemical industry. Synthetic organic chemical industry brings us later on fine things like dyes that don't fade, and that products like nylon, and things like pharmaceuticals. So this is the birth of an important industry, and it all starts with the tinkering of a young chemist in his East End London lab in the 1850s doing his homework assignment. Now, actually, the story is a little more complicated than this. There are precursors. The French are experimenting beforehand and all of that, and then the Germans come along and they really develop the industry. But this is kind of the moment, and this is where my book starts. So my book starts with this business of Perkin, and it says, well, we know about Perkin because we've got historians of chemistry who've studied Perkin and who've written books about him. I want to know what happens next. Well, what happens next is the Germans take this technology and they develop the world's most advanced chemical industry so that on the eve of World War I, they dominate global production of dyes. And what happens is that these chemists, this new technology, makes it possible for textile mills and for the fashion industry to have virtually any color that they want that is accessible, cheap, and color fast. So it's not like the world in the 18th century was not colorful, because it was colorful. You could get bright colors using natural dyes, but those dyes often faded after exposure to the sun or to light, or some of the dyes like purple, like mauve, were really expensive to make. They were made from natural materials, from mollusks, from treating mollusks in a certain way, and it was very expensive, which is why purple was the color of king's robes. That's all fine and good, but what I'm interested in is something different, and I think that this is where this audience in Parsons really fits in so nicely. I asked the question, as I said earlier, once you have the ability to create these reliable dyes, paints, and pigments, how do the creative industries respond to these opportunities? What mechanisms and systems do the creative industries develop to manage this dye explosion? Okay? You've all heard of color forecasting, right? Color forecasting is born out of this dye revolution, in response to this dye revolution. It's born in the 1870s in France. It's perfected here in the United States during the period of the color revolution, starting in the 19-teens and going up to the 1950s. And that's one of the key stories in my book. What you see here is just simply some French fashion plate from the mid to late, from the 1860s, showing mauve. And over here, you see a very early French color forecast. It's too complicated to explain these and how they work at this point in time. So my book looks at, again, how the creative industries, how the textile mills, how the fashion industries, and so on and so forth, the consumer products industries learn to manage color, how they develop tools like this color card to enable them to get a grip on color and to communicate with one another about color. Now, this is an audience that's good for this project because if I give this talk to historians, they don't understand that there are 25 different blacks and that you need a way of figuring out what those 25 different blacks are going to be, selecting them, and then you need a way of naming them and numbering them in order to communicate when you're a 7th Avenue garment manufacturer in 1910 and you want the buttons to match the lining, to match the thread, to match the whatever, okay? So this is kind of a project that gets at the mechanisms in part of what makes the fashion system tick at the nitty-gritty business level. Okay? But what I love to do is I love to make this human, these stories human. And so I look at the people who were involved in this color revolution. So I don't just say color forecasting was invented by the French and then it was taken over by the Americans and perfected. I look at the people like this guy, H. Ledyard Toll, who was a colorist for DuPont Company in the 1920s, for General Motors in the 1920s, and for Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company in the 1930s and 1940s, where he colorized all of these types of products for PPG clients. And so he's one of the people who's mentioned in the Fortune article called Color in Industry. He's described as the guy who can, at GM, make a fat car look slimmer and a short car look longer, because he learned how to manipulate color by being a fine arts painter who studied with painters here in Dumont and other painters here in New York. He was from Brooklyn, but most importantly, he was a World War I camoufleur, and he learned how to manipulate color and visual imagery through camouflage, and he took this expertise on visual manipulation that he learned as a camoufleur and applied it to the design of consumer products. Now back to the 1920s themselves. In the 1920s, you see coming out, back to appliances in the 1920s. In the 1920s, you see coming out of the Paris Exposition, a burst of color in the kitchen. Right here in New York, our very own R.H. Macy's and Company sends buyers to the Paris Exposition. Those buyers see French pots and pans in bright colors and launch a color fad in the 1920s. Flashing forward, however, to wrap up, and my time is up, where do we stand in the 1950s, and how do we deal with what Vance Packard says, and how do we figure out who's right, Nixon or Packard? Well, in order to answer this question, I did what I love to do, and that is to grovel around in the archives. So I used I went to Michigan, and I looked at the papers of the Frigidaire division of General Motors, and I looked at the papers of the styling division of General Motors. These papers were wonderfully revealing in terms of telling us what the actual stylists and salesmen and dealers who were selling those colored appliances thought. So in summary, what we learned from that evidence is that Packard was right to some degree. There was General Motors and the Frigidaire division and other appliance manufacturers did want to use color to stimulate sales, but they didn't want the consumer to treat appliances, as Packard had suggested, like a fashion accessory. Packard actually says, well, these appliance manufacturers want consumers to go out and buy a new appliance every few years and redo their entire kitchen every few years. That was not the objective. The appliance manufacturers are smarter than that. They knew consumers didn't have enough money to do that, and they wouldn't do it. They were hoping that the consumer would eventually replace her white appliances with an ensemble of color appliances, but only as she needed to. So you've kind of got the point that I make here in this chapter about the color revolution in the post-war years is that the story is much more complicated. We've got to look, we can take these pop culture icons such as the kitchen debate and such as Vance Packard's important book, but we've got to dig deeper, and we've got to look for more evidence and understand how design and companies and consumer society work together. So that's just one chapter in the color revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that fabulous presentation. I can't wait to read the book. This is yours, right, Bess? Okay. So our next speaker is Bess Williamson. She is an assistant professor in design history at Columbia College, Chicago. She received her PhD in American Studies from the University of Delaware and her master's in the history of decorative arts and design from Parsons, so we are an alumnus. Welcome back, yay. So it is possible to graduate and go on to great things. So she is published in the Winterthur Portfolio, Design and Culture, and Boom, a Journal of California. And she's currently working on responses to disability rights and disability in design in a book tentatively entitled Designing an Accessible America. Today she'll be speaking on Accessible, Universal, Ugly, Designers Confront Disability. So let's welcome Bess.
All right, and I realized I got a little ahead of myself. I'm speaking to you from the future. Today is not the 29th, but the 28th. I got a little excited, perhaps. But thank you all so much for this conference, and I'm very pleased to be back at Parsons with many old friends. So my topic today is my recent dissertation work on design responses to disability, and their ongoing tensions in the contemporary design world. How do I do this? In 1974, Industrial Design magazine ran a 20-page spread entitled The Handicapped Majority. It featured this full 2-page photo spread with images of people struggling to use basic familiar products: milk cartons, cracker boxes, plaster blister packs, and so on. In these close-up images, the camera lens focused in on the very intimate and immediate interface between hand and object, showing the anguish of struggle with these everyday things. This series of images is notable for a number of reasons. In a periodical pitch to the design professions, it shows not glossy product-focused images or design prototypes, but everyday interactions with seemingly anonymous products. It also shows people who were otherwise unlikely to appear in mainstream pop and consumer culture. People with physical disabilities, older people, performing these basic activities made more difficult by design. The article that accompanied this photo spread discussed disability in unexpected terms as well. Rather than positing an ethical need or desire to, quote, help the handicapped, as was common in design when design magazines addressed this issue, the text argued for the relevance of these disabled persons' design issues and concerns to the broader swath, or the majority of the population. As one designer noted, quote, "A normal person is liable to fall on a polished floor, slip in a bath, or trip over a threshold. He has limitations of reach and can only see over a limited distance." In other words, these limitations were not only experienced by those considered to be, quote unquote, disabled or handicapped. The article asks, indeed, quote, "How many Americans are really normal?" In questioning this category of normal and the understood user of mainstream design, ID picked up on the rhetoric of a new movement in the United States, the one that demanded political rights for people with disabilities. The disability rights movement, among the many rights causes of the late 20th century, has particular implications for the world of architecture and design. Activists challenged the medical definition of disability that focused on physical ailments or disorders and argued instead that it was not their physical differences, but barriers in the broader environment, particularly architecture, that kept them from full participation. They argued then, as well as this article did, that these issues that they confronted were indeed conditions that all human beings will experience, such as including disability, injury, and aging. By the 1970s, a few local codes required basic accommodations for the disabled, but the widespread curb cuts, accessible toilets, ramps, dinging elevators, and so on that we know today as handicapped access was virtually non-existent. These codes, when they did exist in a local manner, were rarely enforced, leading by the late 1970s to widespread protests, as shown here in the month-long occupation of the San Francisco Department of Health, Education, and Welfare that led to the enforced federal regulations that were the basis of later disability rights legislation. From the standpoint then of the 21st century, we could say that disability rights created a revolution in American buildings and infrastructure, but not necessarily in design, given that many practitioners resisted, criticized, and condemned these mandates, and continue to shy away from engaging with these issues, insisting instead on a kind of autonomous practice of architecture and relegating disability issues to kind of the technical world akin to fire safety or heating and cooling. In this paper, I will explore 3 examples to describe how disability rights did and did not revolutionize American design. As designers confronted disability, the new and potentially revolutionary criterion of accessibility opened new possibilities, but also created new conflicts. Ultimately, I think this story reveals some of the limits to defining equal access in terms of a social project that could be achieved by design. The organized rights movement for all people with disabilities took shape in the late 1960s and early 1970s under the influence of broader social changes, including the African American civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the return of many disabled veterans from the Vietnam War. One particular hotspot for this movement was Berkeley, California, not surprisingly considering its other political activity during this time. The University of California at Berkeley had a special program and accessible dormitory for disabled students. And by the mid-1970s, there was a significant population and political movement there of young, active, and politically mobilized people with disabilities. The university's architecture program responded as one professor, Ray Liveshay, developed a series of workshops for his students to observe and collaborate with their local community. Through this project, design students worked with disabled members of the community who were interested and willing, developing models of public and private space that, and hosting these kind of design workshops, as you see in the image here, to refine these designs. And here's another image of kind of the close-up look at these spaces. Rather than work from set technical standards like the standard widths of doorways or heights of countertops, these student architects defined their clients' needs and desires in terms of idealized spatial descriptors. So here's a close-up of one of those models with these notes kind of stuck in as sort of in the process of workshop. These models typically incorporated large open spaces, uncluttered, with easily flexible layouts. And some of the comments from the participants that are pasted in here include, quote, "It's fun to just sit in a spacious room and relax, looking from time to time upwards, and feels like one big space." The stairs on the left-hand side of the model include the annotation, quote, "Stairs float in space, provide nooks, outlooks, hiding." All of these design details incorporate a perspective of a resident with limited mobility or wheelchair user, but the presence of stairs also indicates multi-use, that there's potentially both disabled and non-disabled people living within the same space, and so incorporates their variety of perspectives. This idea of design that addresses the particular needs of people with physical disabilities but leads to a holistic design for all users is the underlying argument behind the term universal design, which was also coined in this period, which brings me to the second example. The term universal design is attributed to Ron Mace, an architect from North Carolina who himself was disabled. He had polio as a child and attended architecture school at North Carolina State University despite an inaccessible campus and the repeated discouragement that he would never work in the field. On graduating, he made accessibility a specialty, came along at the exact right time in the era of the first state and national codes. Mace spent the bulk of his career convincing clients and fellow architects of the very premise of universal design, that it need not cost significantly more, that it needn't be ugly, awkward add-ons to existing design, and in fact that many of these design approaches could benefit a broader population. These images, for example, from a 1991 article, illustrate his argument with features like lever-shaped door handles that not only are an improvement for those with manual limitations, but also anyone just who happens to be carrying groceries, or adjustable height shelving, which are preferable for adaptable housing for wheelchair users, but also can be adjusted with the growth height of a child. But even before Mace coined this term and became known for its arguments, he had been at work on a kind of paradigm change even in representing and discussing disability in architecture from his early work. In 1974, he produced an illustrated version of the handicap section of the North Carolina Building Code, so one of these early codes. To the detailed minutia of the required heights and widths of accessible features, he added these visual illustrations. So he essentially took a list of numbers and added these architectural renderings. He described in his image ways in which basic requirements such as curb cuts could be applied to multiple different design and landscape arrangements. And what's especially notable about this publication, in addition to architectural drawings like this, is that he also included interpretive photographs showing the issues of mobility in public space. So showing, for example, in this long exposure photograph, a wheelchair being dragged up the stairs. And this is how wheelchair users navigated public space before the existence of ramps, asking friends and strangers to help them. He sort of showed in action the alternative to not building in coordination with this code, including even on the inner cover page this rather whimsical image of a wheelchair moving through space. In adding this kind of interpretive imagery to the serious language of code, Mace, even in this early moment, departed from standard representations of disability in terms of just either illness or social concern. But even as figures like Mace were working to promote accessibility for decades, their profession of architecture was, and often indeed remains, skeptical. For many architects, resistance to the new mandate of accessibility primarily manifested in ignoring it, and occasionally complaining about its ramifications. In 1991, a year after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the architect and critic Robert Campbell asked in Architectural Record, "It's accessible, but is it architecture?" Campbell raised two examples of what he saw as poor design implementation of accessibility. He told a story of finding at the airport a bank of only lower height telephone booths and spending, quote, half an hour on my knees making phone calls. His second example was this image of a Beaux-Arts style library in a quaint Maine town where, quote, the steps to the front door were in the process of being engulfed by what promised to be the ugliest concrete ramp constructed in America since the Embarcadero Freeway. And having seen a lot of ramps, I would say I've seen a lot worse. Campbell offered his own vision of design change from kind of an outsider's point of view, asking imaginatively, why don't public phones slide up and down or float at the end of a boom like a Luxo lamp? Or better yet, why don't they contain all the crucial parts in the receiver like the one in my living room? Which is actually, I think, is kind of interesting considering that we now all mostly carry our own phones with us. When it came to architectural add-ons like this library, Campbell proposed that perhaps there could be an aesthetic element to regulations, a clause specifying that, quote, any change in the built environment made for the sake of one segment of the population shall also improve the environment for everyone else. Or if that's not possible, shall at the very least not degrade that environment. How to measure or achieve such a policy he left unanswered, but for all that he represented an outsider's critique, Campbell nonetheless articulated the possibility of a design that would respond to both accessibility and an architect's eye for elegant solution. In these varied responses, from the community-based design process of Ray Lachey to the advocate for the workability of regulations in Ron Mace, to Campbell's insistence on some kind of aesthetic alignment, there is nonetheless a shared faith in the revolutionary quality of design. Only if it's applied in the right measure to the right targets might it work. This ongoing effort to conceptualize an ideal of design for disability reveals, I think, some of the deeper tensions in using design as a tool for social change. Judy Atfield writes in her book Wild Things of design as a distinct category within material culture because of its self-consciousness, the lingering, quote, modern mentality that believes in the possibility of progress through change. We see marks of this decidedly optimistic effort throughout modern history, and they've been, many of them detailed in the last couple of days, as designers have sought to address human and political problems through new styles and forms. But what designers often overlook is the wildness of design once it comes into the world of things, where it's subject to wears and tears, interpretations, and appropriations, not to mention lawyers, lawsuits, and code makers' regulations. Disability rights as a movement strove to shift attention from the infirmities of the body to the problems of design. But the solutions that came from this mandate, in turn, often reveal design as an imperfect, wild thing, unpredictable as some revolutions. Thank you. I'll let you.
Thank you very much for that talk. That was actually really compelling in terms of thinking about political strategies. We're a radical music character, right? Our next speaker is Timo de Riek. Okay, well, we'll go with, well, Timo is, and I'm going to mispronounce everything here, the Premsala Professor of Design Cultures at Universiteit in Amsterdam, and Associate Professor of Design History at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He's an art historian and received his PhD writing on the electrical house, which I would also like to hear about. Sounds good. His book titles include books on Art Deco, Norm equals Form, and Standardization and Design, and he has published very widely. He is also the convener of a conference on design and evolution, and editor of in chief of Morph, which is a good title, magazine of design of the Dutch Design Yearbook, and he's also a member on multiple boards for the government, including advisory board on culture to the Dutch government, the advisory board of the Gerrit Rietveld Academy, and sorry, I'm slaughtering this. Anyway, he's clearly an accomplished human being. He's clearly an accomplished human being with something important to say, and he's going to talk about a radical music carrier, and we're going to hear all about something about tapes and music.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm from the Netherlands, and we are not a country of great innovations or great revolutions. Actually, we never experienced one. We only financed one, and that's yours. At least that's the American one. So we kept it abroad, you know. We're also not a country of revolutions when technology is concerned. So I think these are the two reasons that today I'm going to talk about a revolution of consumption. And I'm going to talk about the music cassette. Not very familiar to you in America maybe, but very familiar in Europe. But I think I'll start with a quote I read in a book, and the book is called Life. And here we go. I discovered a new sound I could get out of my acoustic guitar. That grinding, dirty sound came out of these crummy little motels, where the only thing you had to record with was this new invention called the cassette recorder. Suddenly, you had a very mini studio. Playing acoustic, you'd overload the Philips cassette player to the point of distortion so that when it played back, it was effectively an electric guitar. You were using the cassette player as pickup and amplifier at the same time. We were forcing acoustic guitars through a cassette player, and what came out at the other end was electric as hell. Well, I'm not going to let you guess who told that or has written that down. It was, of course, Keith Richards, guitar player of the Rolling Stones, and he was probably the most famous rock guitarist in the world when he just had hundreds of thousands of boys and girls in their bedrooms, and I have another quote of him, a great one. Just as all the other boys and girls, his fans, discovered the joys of the tiny Philips tape recorder in 1960 and 69. Young people all over the world listened to Street Fighting Man, Gimme Shelter, and Jumping Jack Flash with the same device on which these rock numbers were recorded. Literally with the same device, in Richard's case, as he used the Philips recorder in his hotel rooms, both as mobile amplifier and also as a recording device in making up riffs for his new numbers. The relatively inferior quality of these machines, particularly in comparison to the professional studios to which the bands of the Rolling Stones caliber were accustomed, was in Richard's view an important factor contributing to the jagged rock sound of his guitar playing. It's more or less, you know, the imperfection of the microphone used by human beatboxers in the 1990s. You know, we are more or less irritated by the quality, doing this, you know. And those guys in the 90s used it, like Richard did in the 60s. So much so, in fact, that he regretfully noted that, owing to the improvement Philips had made by adding a limiter in later versions of the device, it lost its charm for the young rock millionaire. Before the Philips recorder became a ubiquitous object in the bedrooms of both Richard and his fans, the recording device had undergone a rigorous transformation, both in technical as well as in consumer terms. In Europe, at the beginning of the 60s, the German Grundig and the Dutch electronics company Philips experimented with small tape recorders with separate or inbuilt cartridges. The small recorders, as these ones, were specifically intended for secretaries and for recording dictated letters and other documents require further processing. Philips presented the EL 3300 series, and this is an advertising for a little bit more luxurious one called the 3302. Very important sometimes. It is an extremely simple cassette record and player with a combined fast-forward, rewind, and play button. In the autumn of 1963, at the Berlin Radio Show, presented. The device, also owing to the microphone that came with it, was intended for professional users such as secretaries, minute takers, and as you can see, journalists. Apart from the small machine itself, the accompanying plastic cartridge equipped with a new magnetic tape made by German manufacturer Bess became an object of international interest. With the aid of the microphone, staff of Philips and of course their children soon discovered that these dictaphones were also an excellent way of recording music on the radio, to listen to it again later. But what this meant above all was personally selected music in a personally selected order. This is crucial. Although the quality of the sound was intended for the functional recording of the spoken word, I just told you, product managers at Philips did realize that the so-called camcorder, as it was named first, without the need for any major adjustments, could be sold to private consumers as a portable music recording and playing device. Philips also understood that the success of the cassette player and the cartridge, as you can see here, depended on the acceptance and even standardization of the new device, and attempted to make international licensing agreements on the production and replication of the tape in equipment made by competing manufacturers. Following negotiations with interested parties Sony in Japan, then still very unknown in the world, Philips released the license to the cassette system in 1965. It was free. Following which numerous manufacturers of tapes and sound equipment and producers of music adopted the compact cassette standard, as it was named. It was only in the States that a roughly comparable 8-track system, introduced in 1965, remained their standard until the 1980s, if I'm correct. The definitive breakthrough of the cassette occurred in the 1970s. Relatively good sound equipment came on the market, and again a generation of progressive music lovers tentatively embraced the cassette. But the equipment was not destined to become popular in the hi-fi sets of enlightened, dedicated aficionados. The young people who saw the new popular music as the basis of their alternative lifestyle appreciated the sound quality of the LPs and the artwork of the LP covers to such a degree that they tended to look down on the humble compact cassette. Moreover, much of that alternative music was not available on the expensive pre-recorded cassettes, the so-called music cassettes. Standardization and individuality, or perhaps a better way of putting it, comfort and self-production, these on the face of it opposing qualities of the cassette did, however, facilitate two other major subcultures. Next time I make you make a guess. It's of course punk and disco. Gave a renewed impulse to the music cassette in the second half of the 1970s. As an element of the out-and-out anarchistic anti-movement, punks believed that to do it yourself was the most important form of expression, counteracting the selection of music made available by major record labels which, in their view, was homogeneous and bourgeois. No other product had ever been so close at hand for punks than the self-compiled music cassettes on which the manufacturer's label was invariably made unrecognizable by a personal designed cut and paste job. In the empathically imperfect punk artwork, an important role was set aside for the sampled, visually comparable equivalent of the cassette, the photocopy. It's unlikely that Philips gained much commercial profit from the endless replaying of personalized punk tapes. That was an entirely different matter for disco music, from which Philips profited through its music company Phonogram, that obtained major successes by also selling the scores for the films Saturday Night Fever and Grease on cassette. But it was Sony, Philips' largest competitor, that launched an unexpected application for the cassette player. The Walkman was a portable stereo cassette player, sometimes even recorder, that came with lightweight headphones of excellent quality, which was crucial. Although the management, Mr. Morita and Ibuka, had come up with their own individual cassette player and for playing classic music on long flights, their new Walkman targeted young people, as you can see over here. The first Walkman, the Sony TPSL-1, was presented in the summer of 1979 in the Yoyogi Park in Tokyo, where the collected press was treated to a show featuring young skateboarders and roller skaters. In airplanes, but also Asian public spaces, the idea of personal music consumption, in which the listener is isolated from his environment, was completely accepted. Morita and Ibuka's idea from Sony was, however, so controversial in Europe that it first met with moral outcry owing to its extreme form of individualistic use. As a result, the Walkman was actually introduced with two headphones in England in order for the music to be at least shared with another person, typically British. Despite the enormous success and realization of a worldwide standard, it was clear from the onset that, technically speaking, the compact cassette would not become the ultimate sound carrier. The quality of the sound was simply too weak. But the more flexible applications and the small dimensions ensured the system's enormous popularity in developing countries, where all the advantages of low price, versatility of use, and standardization proved to be a perfect recipe. What's more, the effects of the inferior sound quality and the great divide between these countries and the Western music industry with their weekly releases were negligible. On the contrary, the opportunities opened up by the cheap cassette player in, for example, Africa and India would lead to a radical shake-up of music production and distribution. In India, for example, the structure of the entire music industry altered dramatically. In the course of the 1980s, the omnipotent British record companies were wiped out by dozens of smaller companies who primarily sold the work of loyally renowned musicians as well as local music genres. This is an example not of India but of Africa. although you might think otherwise if you look at this guy, for instance, who is called Indian Ocean, although he's from Africa, and he has even nothing to do with Sony, although he's named Sony Yachiba. Very curious. With the wealth of expressive resources as a result of flexibility of product and distribution, the options for disseminating extreme religious and political statements was also created. A famous example is the circulation of the Ayatollah Khomeini protest sermons in Iran, about which Associated Press journalist Jeffrey Ulbrich then, in 1979, observed, "It was in exile, however, that the Ayatollah formulated this cassette tactic." The cassette tactic, good word. His early tapes preaching overthrow of the Shah were taken to Iran and distributed among mullahs favorable to the Fedayeen Islam, who played them in mosques. According to some sources, it was from these tapes that the phrase Islamic Republic was heard for the first time, end of quote. It is safe to say that with the introduction of the Walkman, 1979 was a revolutionary turning point in the cassette's career. We may come to a conclusion now, ladies and gentlemen. The highest peak in distribution of the compact cassette occurred around 1980, when Philips and Japanese manufacturers such as Panasonic and primarily Sony again, were pulling out all the stops to develop a new digital sound carrier and to set an associated standard. The compact disc was introduced in that year, allowing the music industry to regain the rights and the control over music production. In the second half of the 60s and in the 1970s, consumers around the globe had settled on the cassette as the ultimate standard in the music industry, and hence on the shared control over composition and distribution, reproduction, and in some cases even taken over production. In contrast to the commercially profitable capitalization on disco hits from the 1970s, the cassette was the do-it-yourself punk protest medium. While manufacturers aimed for technical optimization, the cassette's strength lay in its low-tech image and the ease of use for amateurs. The standardization of this cassette globalized trends in music, such as disco, while simultaneously raising the corporate music industry in large countries to prepare the ground for a flourishing culture of regional music. The Walkman cassette facilitated maximum privacy, but was also at the heart of public aggression expressed through boombox and ghetto blaster. I didn't talk about that today. The flip side of the often coarse exposure of music styles and youth cultures was the cassette's suitability of illegal, secret, and often extreme messages. Owing to its ease of use and the option to record music, the standardized cassette far-reaching individual input open to the user. The radical character of the cassette should not therefore be sought in its technical innovation, but in the unexpected and extremely versatile applications for personal use it brought about. I do thank you very much. I had a final slide, I thought. This one. That's pre-Walkman on the left. Well, you can give a. I'm sorry about the stereotype of the gendered stereotype on the right.
Thank you very much for that stimulating, and not to mention evocative of the internal inconsistencies and potentialities of mediums talk. So hold on, let me find our final person here. So great. Our final presenter for the conference is David Parisi. He comes to us. He's an assistant professor of emerging media in the CAM department of the College of Charleston. His scholarship examines the interface between touch and media technology from the 18th century electrical machines to contemporary computing devices. He got his PhD from NYU's Department of Media, Culture, and Communication, and prior to joining the College of Charleston, he had a postdoc at New Media Literacies at Rutgers, University Center for Cultural Analysis. His most recent work, Tactile Modernity, on the Rationalization of Touch in the 19th Century, sounds gorgeous, appeared in the collection Media, Technology, and Literature in the 19th Century, Media, Sound, and Touch. And today he's going to speak on a crisis of perception, haptic interface design as a response to oculocentric media. So we look forward to finally getting some hapticity here in this conference. Welcome, David.
Hi, thank you. So the title of this talk puts some kind of significant issues on the table. My main focus today is going to be on the discourse around haptic interface design, but before going there, I want to first briefly outline what I understand is this crisis of perception. And I'm going to start with Martin Jay's Downcast Eyes, where he describes the myriad critiques of ocular centrism found predominantly in 20th century French thought as an, and I love this word, an anti-ocular centrism that has turned into a hostility of sight in virtually any of its forms. In anti-ocular centric theories, touch often serves as the conceptual ground from which agitations against the visual are staged, a valorization of different forms of embodied knowledge, which touch provides a shorthand for, counters the detached, clinical, and power-laden rationality of the eye. Touch comes to signify a mode of resistance to the visual, a way of undoing the crisis of perception brought on by vision's dominance. Of course, media technologies play a central role in the elevation of vision and the corresponding loss of the tactile. The visual world is increasingly robbed of its tactile materiality, and the role of touch once played in the apprehension of space is forgotten. However, practical strategies for facilitating this recovery are few and far between. Marshall McLuhan, who despite his lack of Frenchness, does make several appearances in Jay's study, offers one such strategy in his work, suggesting in characteristically deterministic fashion that the rise of electronic media will reactivate this tactile mode of being. Curiously, it is what we often think of as a visual medium that will facilitate this. Borrowing the concept of optical tactility from art history, McLuhan predicted a future where electronic media, television in particular, would make whole the sensorium fragmented by prior media forms. Shameless in his techno-utopianism, McLuhan praised television for its ability to extend the sense of touch and cue, quote, a maximal interplay of the senses, end quote, which would have the effect of retribalizing Western man. McLuhan, however, conflated optical tactility with touch, and as such did not see a difference between media that act directly on the tactile system and those that acted on touch through the mediating organ of the eye. By contrast, at the same time that McLuhan was formulating his arguments about the potential of TV to awaken a neglected tactility, some researchers were beginning to explore the possibility of using the haptic channel to communicate information directly through the skin, bypassing the eyes altogether. Assessing the contemporary state and relevance of haptic interface design is a tricky enterprise. On the one hand, the rising prominence of touchscreen-based mobile devices like tablets and smartphones has called attention to the centrality of touch in interacting with media. And so this is, if you have a smartphone or even a dumb phone, you have a vibrational technology in that device which communicates to you. If you have a video game controller at home, it's got a vibrating thing in it that sends information to you. But this is generally not really considered a robust haptic interface. So on the other hand, the commercialization of what are called high-fidelity haptic interfaces has stagnated in spite of several decades of sustained investment in the technology. Although haptic interfaces are associated with the goggles and gloves virtual reality paradigm of the 1990s, publications related to haptic interfaces actually spiked substantially in the decade after that paradigm was abandoned. And here we see Lawnmower Man very famously kind of popularized this image of a seamless interface between the virtual world and the sense of touch. Lawnmower Man also promised us cybersex suits, which I still haven't gotten one. I'm waiting. So now there are several annual conferences devoted to the project of designing haptic sensations that more accurately replicate the material world. Much to the disappointment of engineers and investors in the field, haptic interface technology seems perpetually on the cusp of providing the, quote, killer app, and we'll see how this kind of plays out in a minute, that will provide users access to a robust and well-defined computer-generated tactile field, similar to what we were promised in Lawnmower Man. For my purposes today, I will highlight two pertinent themes in the haptic interface design literature. The first concerns the way that haptic interface designers, in formulating and justifying their practice, have consistently articulated both explicit and implicit critiques of visualist epistemologies. The second theme relates to the technological construction of tactility. As touch is often assumed, particularly in anti-ocular-centric discourse, to be outside the reach of technology and scientific rationalization, attending to the specifics of its construction by interface designers prompts us to treat touch as a mode of perception already thoroughly permeated and structured by technoscientific agendas. The particulars of this construction have potentially important consequences for how we will experience virtual space going forward as interface designers of the present configure the sensory epistemologies of the future. The design of systems for circulating coded information to the skin began in the 1950s when Frank Gildard described his Vibratese system as an attempt to speak, and this is a quote that Gildard used often, in, quote, the tongue of the skin. Subsequent to the development of Vibratese, and this is the Vibratese alphabet, it's a 45 character set of codes. Subsequent to the development of Vibratese, Gildard founded the Cutaneous Communication Lab, which operated out of Princeton University from 1962 until 2004, and was guided by his belief that, provided with an appropriate set of codes, the skin's communicative capacity could be successfully exploited. Today, I am not as concerned with the system itself as I am with the rationale Gildard provided for its necessity. The visual and oral environments in modern life, he argued, had become crowded and chaotic, and this is a quote from Gildard. There is a nearly universal dependence on vision and audition in all important affairs of human existence, on business and industry, on the highway, in sports and recreational activities, in the scientific laboratory, in the operation of military equipment. Indeed, our eyes and our ears are assaulted so continuously, such frequent and insistent demands are placed on them, that the visual and auditory channels are seriously overburdened at times. Such oversaturation leads quite naturally to the question of whether it is only vision and hearing that can serve in communication. And what this system was is a set of 5 vibrating motors distributed across the skin. Each one was capable of 3 steps of intensity and 3 steps of duration, so each motor had 9 different characters that it could convey. And Gildard trained his subjects to actually read really quickly using this, what is essentially framed as a sort of tactile Morse code in Gildard's work. The decades of research that followed involved mapping the skin's capacity to discriminate between different types of tactile sensations. Through the structured application of psychophysiological methods, these discriminatory capacities were quantified and assigned to discrete but interrelated modes of perception, each capable of decoding its own set of signals. Vibratese, for instance, relied on the skin's capacity for distinguishing between location, so where the motor was on the skin, duration, how long the motor vibrated for, and intensity, the intensity of the vibration. The question of what sensations would be treated as noise by the tactile channel and what would be treated as, what could be received as signal, served to structure empirical research on tactility. In responding to the problem of ocular-centric communication, Gildard and his collaborators at the Cutaneous Communication Lab mapped previously uncharted landscapes of touch. Another research paradigm began in the late 1960s as computer interface designers, pushing against the limits of graphical display, developed systems for rendering the material characteristics of virtual objects as tactile sensations. Ivan Sutherland's 1965 essay, The Ultimate Display, recently dubbed a, quote, seed bomb of emergent technologies, Bruce Sterling really knows how to turn a phrase, outlined his vision for a plurisensory display device capable of acting directly on the user's bodies. And I'm quoting here from the very end of the essay. Sutherland says, the ultimate display would, of course, be a room within which the computer can control the existence of matter. This is a really powerful computer. A chair displayed in such a room would be good enough to sit in. Handcuffs displayed in such a room would be confining, and a bullet displayed in such a room would be fatal. So this is Sutherland's vision of, this is the killer app, right? The app that can literally kill you. Sutherland's vision has proven difficult to realize, but in attempting to do so, haptic interface designers have valorized the role of touch in apprehending and constructing space, as I'll show in the next couple of examples. Michael Knoll, working just across the river at the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, described a force rendering device that would simulate the feeling of a 3-dimensional shape on a computer screen as the user's hand represented as a cursor and actually held right there in that knob at the top, came into contact with it. His 1971 dissertation, Man-Machine Tactile Communication, justified the utility of the device by describing the value tactile sensations provided in supplementing and challenging vision. Quote, "The graphical representation of complicated surfaces and solid objects has always been extremely difficult, even using stereoscopic techniques. A tactile rendering had the advantage, sorry, that's the end of the quote. A tactile advantage had the, rendering had the advantage of revealing details hidden and obscured in the graphical world. Quote, tactile communication is most suitable for representing complicated surfaces and objects which would be too detailed to represent graphically," end quote. Writing in a 1972 article for the Society of Information Display, Knoll noted, "Man-machine tactile display emerges not as a supplement for computer-generated visual displays, but primarily as an entirely new man-made communication medium or channel of vast importance for its own unique abilities to represent surfaces and objects. The tactile channel is a competitor to the visual channel, and this situation is something new to the field of computer science," end quote. So there, you really see Knoll trying to carve this new area of information display out. Knoll's work embodies both themes outlined earlier. By citing the benefits of a tactile mode of knowing over and against the visual modality, he presented a criticism of the ocular-centric bias in information display. By designing a system for encountering virtual space through touch, he embedded a particular model of touching in the interfacing apparatus. Knoll privileged this single-point mode of touching, one that locates the hand as a primary agent of touch. And here we can contrast this with Gildard's model, which was projecting information onto the skin. This is a model where the hand actively moves through space. With the maturation of the field in the decades since Knoll's dissertation, the practice of haptic rendering has emerged as a discrete field of inquiry. The practice of haptography, put forth by Okamura, Kuchenbacher, and Mavich in 2008, quote, "involves acquiring real-world data, building an appropriate model, and authentically rendering it through a haptic interface," end quote. Authentic rendering is sort of what Okamura refers to as a sort of haptic Turing test, where what's important isn't the successful rendering of a one-to-one copy of the material world, but rather the extent to which the user can be tricked into thinking that an object that isn't physically present is. And this is the phantom haptic interface device. And what this does is basically a further development of Knoll's principle, where you're moving the stylus through space. When you encounter an object in the virtual world, that object is assigned properties, and the stylus stops in your hand depending on the characteristics of the item. And haptic rendering basically captures the material properties of an object and then displays it through this forced rendering device. Much like the optical toys described in Crairy's techniques of the observer, it is the tactile system's capacity to misperceive that haptic rendering aims to exploit. And as in Crairy's thesis, developing these technologies required generating new knowledge about the sense of touch that was to be fooled. But unlike mapping the visual, this project is still very much a work in progress, to the consternation of many interface designers. One of the, quote, bottlenecks designers face concerns the difficulty of precisely measuring and quantifying the psychophysical parameters of the haptic sense. And they kind of repeat this lament every decade. They complain that they just can't get it quite right. And even now in the stuff that's coming out today, there's still, as much work as they've done on the subject, they still can't quite get all the parameters of replicating this tactile world right. Haptic rendering as a practice is grounded in the aim of using technology to do for touch what photography did for the eye and the phonograph did for the ear. And this sort of evolutionary language is used with regularity in the discourse. The technology that evolves the senses has left touch behind, and the haptic interface designer acts as an agent in the process of catching touch up to the other components of an already fragmented sensorium. Restoring balance to the senses does not involve a flight from technologies of perception, but rather a deepening of their penetration into the skin. Each brings with it, to borrow from Marinetti's Manifesto of Tactilism, a set of tactile values, sensations the interface is capable of rendering for the user. Here, these are whole hand haptic interfaces. This is Immersion Corporation, which I think is a wonderfully Gibsonian name for an interface design company. And we can see the way that there's a stark difference between this and the single point technologies. So close up of that. I want to close by suggesting that the technological recuperation of touch only occurs once media technologies have pushed its conspicuous absence to the surface. The overt concern over ocular centrism in media systems expressed by interface designers stages their solution to the problem. In order to address the situation, they use technology to recover the lost mode of the haptic, but in doing so, they fundamentally alter what constitutes the haptic. For McLuhan, aiming at a similar problem, the technological solve applied to reawaken the tactile system, a televisual optical tactility, requires the brain to do the labor of translating images into tactile sensations. With haptic interface design, by contrast, the tactile system is reawakened once an interface speaks directly to it. The computer translates data into a form legible to a very particularly and strategically constructed sense of touch. Haptic interface design is thus a practice that aims to transform the sensory epistemology of virtual space through the technological reconstitution of what it means to touch. I'll end with a couple of quick examples that illustrate the way technology does this labor of translation. The first, and don't tell the right-wing pro-life people about this, the first is the Touch system. This is designed in Italy in 2003, 2004, and has since been kind of abandoned, but this is a phantom, which we saw here. This is a phantom that's actually used, what they do is they translate the ultrasound data into tactile materiality that the mother, this is intended to reduce maternal stress and anxiety. This is the goal of the device. If you tell Virginia about this, they'll probably make everyone go through one of these if they want an abortion. And then the second is the TN, and this is the model for how the data gets transmitted. And then the second is the TN Games third space helmet and vest. This is available at Best Buy for $150, little cheaper than the Touch system. And what this does is this projects impact sensations, a gaming device. It projects impact sensations on the user. The head, if you get shot in the head in a first-person shooter, it'll kind of ding you. The vest feels like getting punched by someone with really small hands. So each of these devices embodies a different mode of touch and prioritizes a different relationship to tactile space. If haptic interfaces contain an explicit promise to revolutionize mediated perception, the specifics of how they do so demands our attention. Were any of these devices to become a, quote, killer app or dominant mode of haptic interfacing, the model of touching embedded in it would assume a hegemonic position in relationship not just to the other senses, but among competing models of technoscientific tactility. Thank you.